My name is Samuel Green. I'm 59 years old, a retired structural engineer, and the kind of man who finds more peace in the steady ripple of water than in the chatter of people. Ever since I left the city behind 7 years ago, I've lived a quiet life in the same house my grandfather built in 1953, an old ranch-style home tucked into the back edge of Rosewood Bluffs, an HOA-controlled community in the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina. Most people wouldn't even know my home was part of the neighborhood. It sits at the end of a gravel road, behind a thick row of pine and cedar trees, nearly half a mile from the nearest cul-de-sac. The land it sits on, 2.4 acres, was deeded separately before the HOA even existed, back when property boundaries were scribbled on parchment in the county clerk's office. My grandfather, Lester Green, was a cartographer during World War II and knew every inch of this region. When he returned home from the war, he bought up this parcel and several adjoining lots before development reached these hills. He passed the house down to my father, who passed it to me. I spent my career building bridges, actual ones with steel and cable, yet it was this place that always grounded me. After my divorce and after the accident that took my younger brother, something still don't speak about easily. I found myself here alone but not lonely. I planted a garden. I restored the stone path he laid with his bare hands. And 3 years ago, I built a pool. Not a massive resort-style pool, just a clean 30 by 15-foot rectangle with hand-tiled edges and a natural stone waterfall that trickled into it like a spring. I designed it as a tribute to my grandfather's love of fresh water, of flowing maps and mountain streams. The pool sits in the clearing behind my home where the trees open into a small meadow. Cardinals and robins frequent the oaks. Dragonflies skim the surface at dusk. I swim every morning, even in the colder months, when I heat the water just enough to make the mist rise. There's no music out there, no concrete walls, just sky trees and water. And until last summer, no one had ever bothered me. That changed the day I noticed a flyer stuck into the metal latch of my front gate. A generic mass-printed notice from the Rosewood Bluffs HOA. I'll admit I didn't think much of it at first. Usually their notices involved holiday decoration reminders or neighborhood barbecue announcements, none of which I ever attended. But when I opened it, the wording was, "Off. Dear resident, our community is currently undertaking an evaluation of shared amenities and recreational areas. If you have any recreational structures that may affect communal aesthetics or land usage compliance, please report them to the HOA by August 10th. Non-compliant features may be subject to review or removal." Rosewood Bluffs Board of Directors, I read it 3 times. Recreational structures affecting communal aesthetics, review or removal. I set the flyer down and exhaled. A feeling stirred in my gut, the kind that told me something was about to shift. That night, I double-checked the parcel map I kept in a fireproof box in my study. My grandfather had framed the original 1952 county deed above his workbench in the garage, and I'd made sure to obtain every updated record when I inherited the house. Every square foot of this property, every cedar tree, every inch of the pool was private land. Not HOA maintained. Not even on the same tax map as the rest of the development. So I brushed it off. Then came the visit. It was a Monday, late August, humid enough that the glass on my porch table sweated into a puddle beneath my coffee mug. I was patching the mortar around the edge of the pool when I heard the crunch of gravel in my driveway. I walked around the corner and saw her for the first time, Karen Delaney, HOA president. She was dressed like a property manager, trying too hard to look approachable, beige pantsuit, HOA-issued polo shirt with RBHOA embroidered in maroon clipboard in hand, and a Bluetooth headset in one ear. Her SUV, a spotless white Escalade, idled behind her like a throne. "Mr. Green," she called, not bothering to hide the tone of authority in her voice. I nodded. I'm Karen Delaney, president of the Rosewood Bluffs HOA, she said, approaching the gate. We need to talk about your pool. There it was. No small talk. No neighborly smile. Just an opening shot. I stayed calm. What about it? She glanced down at her clipboard, then back at me. It's come to our attention that your property contains a recreational water feature that may not comply with community design standards. It was not part of the original HOA-approved plans, and as such may fall under non-permitted modifications. I blinked silent for a moment. I'm not sure you understand. This land, my land, is not subject to HOA architectural review. I'm grandfathered out. Literally. The deed dates back to before your board existed. She smiled tightly, like someone used to not being told no. Be that as it may, the neighborhood covenants include a clause about amenities that may be visibly accessible to other residents and therefore affect property values. We've had several inquiries about your pool and its exclusive nature. That last part landed oddly. Exclusive nature. I didn't build it to exclude anyone, I said evenly. I built it for myself, on private land. Well, she said, tapping her clipboard, we'll need to verify that. If you could provide proof of ownership and your architectural permit, we may be able to file a compliance exemption, though that would still require board approval. I stared at her. You want me to prove I own land my family's held for 70 years, so a board I'm not even subject to can decide whether I'm allowed to use it? Her smile widened. It's standard procedure. I'm sure we can come to a mutual agreement. I didn't say what I was thinking, that this wasn't about aesthetics or community cohesion or rules. It was about the fact that I had something she wanted. And I could already see the glint in her eye, the way she looked beyond me toward the pool like a hawk circling a rabbit. That evening, I sat on the edge of the water as dusk fell, listening to the soft gurgle of the waterfall I'd built. I knew enough about power plays to understand where this was headed. She wasn't asking. She was circling, probing, testing to see if I'd resist or roll over. But I wasn't just some aging loner with a pretty backyard. She had no idea who actually owned the land, and I wasn't about to let her find out the hard way. 3 days after Karen Delaney's visit, I received an envelope in the mail, plain white, no return address, beyond RBHOA, but the kind of envelope that made your fingers tense just holding it. It wasn't thick, just a single page inside, but the paper had that corporate weight to it. The kind that says, "We're serious and we're not afraid of ink." I opened it slowly at my kitchen table, the early morning sun casting angled shadows across the counter. I read the letter once, then twice as the taste of my black coffee turned sour in my mouth. Notice of non-compliance. Dear Mr. Green, our records indicate that you have constructed a recreational water feature, i.e., an in-ground pool without architectural approval from the Rosewood Bluffs HOA. This constitutes a violation of the community's Unified Design and Usage Standards per Article 4, Section C. In accordance with our community guidelines, you are hereby notified to remove the non-compliant structure or present exemption documentation within 14 days of this notice. Failure to comply may result in the HOA taking corrective action, including but not limited to assessment of fines, revocation of neighborhood privileges, or structural removal at the property owner's expense. Sincerely, Karen Delaney, President, Rosewood Bluffs. HOA. I set the letter down, my jaw clenched. Corrective action. Structural removal. Was this a game to her, or had she genuinely convinced herself that this stretch of land was under her domain? I walked out to the edge of the pool and stood in the center of the stone-paved patio I'd laid with my own hands. The wind rustled through the oak trees like whispered laughter. My grandfather's old boundary marker, a cast iron stake driven deep into the southwest corner of the land, sat just beyond the hedge. I knew it was still there because I checked it every few years, habit, I suppose, from a lifetime of building things that needed to last. I retrieved a leather folder from my fireproof box. Inside were the original deeds maps and a yellowed survey report dated 1953, signed in my grandfather's cursive. I flipped through the pages with care. Every inch of the backyard, including the pool, sat outside the jurisdictional lines of the HOA charter, which was filed decades after this land was purchased. Technically, I wasn't even obligated to pay dues, though I always had just to avoid friction. But now, friction was unavoidable. I decided to respond not with emotion, but with precision. Response to HOA notice. September 2nd. Dear Ms. Delaney, I received your notice of non-compliance regarding the pool located on my private property. Please be advised that the land in question falls outside the jurisdiction of the Rosewood Bluffs HOA, as confirmed by the original deed recorded in 1953 and reinforced by parcel maps on file with the Buncombe County Recorder's Office. The parcel at 4 Hillcrest Glen Way, my residence, was never annexed into HOA territory and thus does not fall under your design standards or architectural review committee. Accordingly, no action will be taken on my part. Respectfully, Samuel Green. I printed the letter, attached copies of the relevant legal documents, and walked it down to the HOA drop box myself. It was housed in a little brick kiosk near the clubhouse, a building I rarely approached. The place had always struck me as absurd, a faux colonial meeting hall, complete with white columns and a conference room that tried too hard to look like a country club. HOA board members were often inside, pacing like middle managers preparing for a coup. As I approached the kiosk, I noticed Karen's SUV parked nearby again. Through the tinted glass, I could see her on a call, animated, one hand slicing the air, while the other gripped her phone. I wondered if she saw me slip the envelope into the slot. I hoped she did, because I was done being quiet. The next morning, I found a second notice, this one slipped between my screen door and front door. Second notice, escalation pending. Mr. Green, as you have failed to demonstrate compliance with HOA regulations, we are now entering the escalation phase of enforcement. The HOA board reserves the right to inspect the property to determine the extent of the violation. If the non-compliant feature is not removed or exempted, structural removal may be scheduled. Enforcement action may include coordination with county services. Respectfully, Rosewood Bluffs HOA Board. They were bluffing, or so I thought. 2 days later, while trimming the hedges near the pool, I saw them. Karen, 2 HOA board members, and a man I didn't recognize, tall, wearing khaki, and a tool belt, approaching through the trees. They didn't knock. They walked around the house like they owned it. "Excuse me," I called out, shears still in my hand. Karen turned. "We're here for a preliminary inspection." "You're trespassing," I said. Calm but firm. "We have the authority to inspect community violations." "Not on my land," I replied. "This isn't common space, and I didn't authorize this visit." Karen gestured to the man with the tool belt. "This is Tom Massey. He's a licensed contractor. We need to assess whether the structure poses any safety hazards or encroachments onto communal land." I raised an eyebrow. "Do you have a warrant, a court order?" She hesitated. "We have board approval." "That's not the same," I said, stepping in front of them. "This property is private, not under HOA control. Unless you have legal documentation or law enforcement with you, I'm going to ask you to leave. Now." The contractor looked uncomfortable. "Maybe we should come back." Karen glared at me, then turned on her heel. "This isn't over," she muttered as they left. I knew she meant it. That night I turned on the floodlights around the property, checked every boundary stake. I even emailed a friend of mine from the county records department asking for certified copies of the parcel maps and boundary definitions. I had a feeling I'd need them. By the weekend, whispers had begun. Neighbors I'd never spoken to slowed their walks past my fence. One even asked if the pool was going to be open for HOA use soon. It hit me then Karen had been spreading a narrative, that the pool was intended for the community, that I was the selfish recluse hoarding a luxury meant for others. It wasn't just about water or land anymore. It was about power. But I had something Karen didn't: truth, history, and patience. She'd opened a fight she didn't understand, and I was just getting started. It was just after sunrise when I saw her again. I'd been standing barefoot on the pool deck, sipping my coffee, watching the low morning fog drift over the water like a breath held too long. The mist clung to the surface, curling around the stone edges, making everything feel suspended in time. For a moment I imagined I was back in the Appalachians as a boy camping with my grandfather, chasing stories he'd embroidered into maps. Then I heard the gate latch click. It was a deliberate sound, metal on metal, not the wind. I turned toward the wooden entrance where the hedgerow broke, and there she was. Karen Delaney. She wasn't alone this time. A younger man trailed behind her, mid-30s, clipboard and hand phone raised as if documenting. He wore that unmistakable look of someone told he had authority, but unsure what to do with it. Karen, on the other hand, carried herself with the confidence of a woman certain the rules bent for her. Her lips curved in something too sharp to be called a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Green," she called out, stepping inside my gate as though it were hers. I didn't move from my spot. "You're trespassing. Again." She waved a piece of paper in the air. "We're conducting an assessment in accordance with HOA Resolution 7.2.2. This gentleman is with our compliance committee. We're here to document your structure and record proximity to common boundary lines." "There are no boundary violations," I replied, my voice even. "And your resolutions don't apply to this parcel." She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the layout of the pool. "That's yet to be determined. The board voted unanimously to investigate further after receiving complaints." "Complaints?" I tilted my head. Karen nodded. "Several residents have expressed concern about this amenity. Its exclusivity, its impact on neighborhood aesthetics, and frankly, its symbolism." "Symbolism," I repeated. "You mean the fact that I built something on my own land without asking your permission?" She ignored that. "This area could serve the whole community. Imagine turning this space into a shared oasis. It would boost home values, unify the neighborhood, set a standard." "It's not yours to unify," I said flatly. "This isn't communal land." It never was. Karen's tone sharpened. "The HOA exists to serve the greater good. Sometimes that means revisiting outdated designations, especially when those designations affect cohesion." That word again, cohesion, as if my independence was a virus. The man beside her began snapping photos. I stepped forward. "You're done here," I said. "You take one more photo and I'll call the sheriff. I have every legal document showing this land predates your association. You are not welcome on my property without consent or court order." Karen's jaw flexed. The man lowered his phone. "I'll be filing a formal motion," she said. "You're being unreasonable." "No," I said. "I'm being lawful. There's a difference." Without another word, she turned, heels crunching the gravel path as she retreated through the gate. The man followed noticeably faster. Once they were gone, I walked to my office and opened the locked cabinet that held my deeper files, the ones not for casual reference. I pulled out a faded envelope marked L. Green Original Boundaries and laid its contents across my desk. Inside were hand-drawn plats, signed notarized letters from land surveyors, and a typewritten amendment from 1972, clarifying the parcel's independence from surrounding developments. The legal language was dense but clear. My land was its own jurisdiction. I photocopied everything, then made 3 separate packets, one for my records, one for my attorney, and one for the County Land Commission. If Karen wanted a motion, she'd get resistance in kind. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I walked the perimeter of the property. My boots crunched the underbrush as I passed each iron stake hammered into the soil by my grandfather decades ago. I touched each one like a talisman, reaffirming its presence, feeling its cold certainty under my fingers. The stakes weren't just markers, they were stories. Boundaries weren't lines, they were promises. Of heritage, of quiet labor, of solitude earned and defended. 2 days later, I received a notice via certified mail. Notice of motion to reconsider boundary designation. Mr. Green, please be advised that the Rosewood Bluffs HOA Board will convene on September 14th to discuss a motion to reclassify your parcel under Article 6, Clause B. Adjacent parcels affecting neighborhood cohesion. The board will consider whether your property may be incorporated into HOA jurisdiction based on present-day use and communal impact. You are invited to present documentation or objections at this meeting. Failure to attend will be interpreted as non-opposition. Sincerely, Karen Delaney, President RBHOA. It was audacious, laughable even. The idea that a board formed 40 years after this home was built could reclassify private land with a vote. But it wasn't funny, because I knew how these things worked. One whisper in the wrong ear, one slick maneuver at the county assessor's office, one sympathetic judge, and suddenly I'd be mired in injunctions and paperwork and hearings that dragged for months. This wasn't just a battle over a pool. It was about erasure. I made a call to my attorney, an old friend named Ben Callahan. He had the weary tone of someone who'd spent too many years dealing with HOA cases and too few seeing justice win out. She's playing a long game, he said. They don't want the land, Sam. They want control. The pool is just their excuse. But the moment they make this a public matter, perception will be half the fight. Then we get ahead of it, I said. I started with the county, sent certified letters to the land office zoning department and property assessor. I met with 2 clerks who confirmed my parcel's exemption and offered to sign letters affirming the legal chain of ownership. I submitted copies of every boundary marker and notarized document I had down to the surveyor's signature in 1953. Then I contacted a local reporter, a woman named Emily Tran, who'd written several pieces on overreaching HOAs and property disputes in the region. When I met her at the fence line, she listened patiently as I explained the history of the land, my grandfather's legacy, and the recent attempts to reclassify my property. You have records, she asked. I handed her a folder. More than records. I have history. Her article hit the Asheville Tribune 3 days later. Private legacy or public property HOA controversy heats up in Rosewood Bluffs. It included photos of the original deeds, a shot of my grandfather's signature, and a quote from me that read, "My land isn't a battleground. It's a memory I'm protecting." By the time Karen received her copy, the phone at HOA headquarters must have rung off the hook. The next day, I saw her again. At the gate. Not with a clipboard this time, but with something else entirely. A smile. Karen's smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes. It was a politician's smile, tight-lipped, performative, as if rehearsed in a mirror. She stood just outside the gate this time, not daring to cross the threshold. The metal latch between us was symbolic now, a line she'd tried to blur, but could no longer deny. I stepped outside with deliberate calm, holding a manila folder tucked under my arm. It was early evening. The cicadas were beginning their song, and the sun slanted low across the trees, casting golden bars over the driveway gravel. "Evening, Mr. Green," she said, arms folded like she was posing for a magazine cover. "Karen," I replied with a nod. "I read the article," she began. "Very moving. You clearly have a strong sense of history." "I do," I said. "Do you?" She blinked. "Excuse me. You're standing on land older than your HOA, older than most of the people living in this neighborhood. It was mapped by hand, marked by my grandfather with a compass and sweat and ink. That pool you're so interested in, it's built on soil he cleared himself. That waterfall, it trickles through the same rock he used to sharpen his tools." Karen exhaled. "I'm not here to argue." "No," I asked, one brow lifting. "I came to propose a compromise," she said, clasping her hands. "The board is willing to drop the motion to incorporate your parcel if you'll agree to allow limited HOA access to the pool during community events, perhaps once a month, for the children, for cohesion." There was that word again, cohesion. I shook my head. "You're offering to stop trying to take what's mine. If I give you what's mine—" Her lips tightened. "You don't see the problem with that?" I asked. Her tone turned brittle. "Sam, if you continue down this path, you'll make yourself a pariah. The neighborhood talks. People are starting to see you as hostile, stubborn. This could all end quietly, gracefully." I pulled the manila folder from under my arm and handed it to her through the gate. She hesitated, then took it. "What's this?" Everything I said. The original land deed, the 1953 survey, the notarized exemption from 1982, the plat map showing the HOA boundary ending a full 60 yards before my front step, and letters from 2 county officials affirming the legal jurisdiction. She flipped through it, her eyes scanning the pages rapidly. "I suggest you read it carefully," I added, "because next time you step onto my land without permission, it won't be a newspaper that hears about it. It'll be a judge." She closed the folder slowly. "I underestimated you," she murmured. "I'm used to that," I said, turning back toward the house. "Good night, Karen." That weekend, I drove 3 counties over to visit the last man who'd walked this land with my grandfather, Rufus Harlan, 87 years old, and still sharp as a pine needle. He lived in a modest cabin deep in the hills, surrounded by maps and coffee cans full of nails and screws. When I arrived, he met me on the porch with a handshake that felt like rope. "I heard you've been having trouble with the suits," he said. "HOA," I replied. He chuckled. "Those are just suits with extra paper." I handed him a copy of the same folder I'd given Karen. "I need your memory, Rufus. Anything you remember from the old days. The boundaries, the surveys. Any interaction your father or mine had with developers." He motioned for me to sit, then disappeared inside, and returned with a battered journal. "My daddy was a land agent," he said. "Kept notes on every deal he ever helped make." He flipped through, and there it was on a page yellowed by time and coffee stains. L. Green's parcel, fully private. Bound by creek to East Oaks to north. Not part of Ridgeview expansion. Signed off by Township 1953. Not HOA jurisdiction. He let me photograph the page, even signed a statement with his recollection, and we got it notarized at the gas station on the way back into town. By now, I wasn't just fighting Karen. I was building a war chest. When I returned home, a glossy flyer had been taped to my gate. Community Unity Picnic, sponsored by the Rosewood Bluffs HOA. This Saturday at 12 p.m., featuring BBQ live music and a refreshing dip in the newly discovered neighborhood pool, bringing us together one splash at a time. There it was. They were planning to use it, publicly, boldly. Karen must have assumed I'd cave or that public momentum would shame me into silence. But what she didn't know was that I'd already filed for a cease and desist order that morning. I'd attached every legal document, every map, every letter and photo. I'd even hired a real estate attorney to draft a formal property boundary affidavit, ready to file with the county should this escalate. Saturday arrived warm and cloudless. I watched from the edge of my kitchen window as families gathered on the clubhouse lawn, music drifting faintly through the trees. Then around 1 p.m. I saw them. Karen, too, HOA board members, and at least a dozen people, parents with kids in swimsuits approaching my property. They carried towels, picnic baskets, folding chairs. Karen opened the gate. This time I was ready. I stepped outside with my attorney Ben at my side. He wore khakis and a loose polo but carried an envelope in one hand and a badge clipped to his belt. He'd worked as a special land use consultant for the county before retiring to private practice. "Good afternoon," he called out. "I'm Benjamin Callahan. This property is privately owned. You are currently in violation of trespass law per NC Code 14-159.2. Karen stopped mid-step. Ben handed her the envelope. "This is a court-issued cease and desist order effective immediately," he said. "Any attempt to use this pool or access the land without written consent will be considered unlawful trespass and subject to fines." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's face went white. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said weakly. "No misunderstanding," I said. "This is private property, not HOA jurisdiction, not community property, not your backyard to redecorate." One of the parents pulled their child back by the shoulder. Another turned around completely. Within minutes, the crowd was gone. Karen stood alone at the edge of the pool. "This could have gone differently," she said quietly. "It still can," I replied. "You step back, leave it alone, and I won't press charges." She said nothing, just walked out the gate and disappeared behind the hedge. Later that evening, I sat alone by the water, the stone beneath me still warm from the afternoon sun. I thought of my grandfather, how he mapped this land, measured every foot, protected it with quiet dignity. I thought of my father, who passed down that same reverence. And I thought of myself, a man who only wanted peace, but who wouldn't let history be rewritten out of convenience. This wasn't just about a pool. It was about a legacy, and I would protect it with everything I had. It started with the rumble. Not thunder, not distant traffic. This was heavier, closer, mechanical. I recognized it immediately. You don't spend a career around infrastructure and not know the sound of heavy equipment when you hear it. It was late Monday afternoon, 5 days after the cease and desist had been served, and I was pruning the hedge along the southern edge of the property when the low, grating hum reached my ears. I stood still, clippers frozen mid-snip, listening. Then it grew louder. I stepped through the gate and followed the driveway up toward the road. That's when I saw it. A flatbed truck with a bulldozer on the back. Bright yellow. Fresh paint. The HOA's logo stenciled on the door of the accompanying maintenance van. Karen stood beside it, arms crossed, flanked by 2 men in reflective vests. It took a second for my brain to catch up. They weren't bluffing anymore. I walked straight toward them. "What is this?" I asked, calm but sharp. Karen turned, a smile creeping across her lips like oil. "We're preparing for potential enforcement." Enforcement of what? She pulled out a clipboard. You've failed to comply with community integration efforts. The board has voted to proceed with the removal of unapproved structures that impact neighborhood unity. The pool falls under that category. You're on the wrong side of the law, I said. You received a court order. That order's being contested, she replied. We filed an appeal this morning. I took a deep breath, measured and slow. You filed an appeal. That doesn't nullify the existing order. You know that, right? We're within our rights to begin logistical preparation, she said, glancing toward the bulldozer. Try moving that machine onto my property, I said, and you'll find out exactly how much your appeal protects you. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she stepped closer. Why are you fighting this, Sam? It's just a pool. You live alone. You barely use it. It could benefit everyone. I stared at her. This isn't about the pool. She blinked, confused. It's about control, I said. You see land, water, and regulations. I see memories, promises, and boundaries that deserve to be honored. Karen's jaw tensed. You can't win this forever. I don't need forever, I said. I just need long enough. She didn't respond, just turned on her heel and walked back toward the van. The men followed. The bulldozer stayed on the flatbed for now. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the pool with a legal pad in my lap, flashlight balanced on the chair arm, sketching out every possible angle of defense. I mapped every inch of the property, not just physically, but emotionally, where my grandfather first taught me to swim, where my father fixed the stone pathway after a storm, where I built the small waterfall as therapy after the divorce. This was more than land. It was grief, joy, history, all layered like the sediment under my feet. The next morning, I visited the county courthouse again. I need an emergency injunction, I told the clerk. They're planning demolition. She flipped through my folder. You've already got more documentation than most people who come in here for property disputes. That's because it's not a dispute. I said, it's harassment. She nodded, stamped my application, and handed it off to the judge's clerk. 12 hours later, I had the injunction in hand. Official, immediate, enforceable. I made 3 copies, one to post on the gate, one to mail to the HOA, and one to give to Ben. But I didn't stop there. I contacted the local news again. This time I didn't ask for a quiet profile piece. I asked for a camera crew. By Friday, a van with the station's logo rolled up outside my house. Emily Tran stepped out, notepad in hand, her cameraman following close behind. This seems to be escalating, she said as she looked around. You could say that, I replied. I gave her everything, the letter, the court order, the boundary maps, and the story of the bulldozer that had yet to leave the cul-de-sac. As the interview rolled, I stood by the pool and said the truth out loud. This land is my inheritance. This water is my sanctuary. And this fight. This isn't about a fence or a gate or a pool. It's about standing your ground when someone tries to rewrite history for convenience. It's about saying no when the world tells you to give in. The story aired that night. By morning, my inbox was flooded with messages. Former HOA members from other communities, homeowners with similar experiences, even a retired judge who offered legal insight on boundary preservation. But the most surprising was the voicemail I received late that evening. It was from Councilwoman Renee Hargrove. I hadn't spoken to her in years, not since I'd helped inspect a bridge restoration project downtown. Mr. Green, her voice said, measured but warm. I saw the report. I'd like to meet. Privately. I think you might need some help navigating this storm. We met at a quiet cafe the next morning. She listened carefully as I laid everything out, the notices, the false claims, the manipulation. "This isn't just an HOA problem," she said finally. "This is systemic overreach." "What can I do?" I asked. "Let me handle the city side," she said. "But you need to rally your own defense, too." "What do you mean, don't just defend your land?" she said. "Make people care about it." That evening I walked to the fence line and posted a hand-painted sign, "Community Land Walk and History Tour. This Sunday at 3 p.m. Learn the history of this land, its stories, and why it matters." I didn't know who would come, but by Sunday afternoon, over 30 people showed up, neighbors, locals, even some kids from the high school journalism club. I walked them through the property, showed them the boundary markers, the hand-drawn maps, the old tool shed my grandfather built with nothing but timber and grit. I told them about the pool, not just when I built it, but why. About the loneliness I was drowning in after the divorce. About how the sound of water saved me when nothing else could. There were no speeches, no shouting, just the truth. Raw, real, and standing in the open air. Karen watched from a distance. She didn't say a word, but I could tell that she knew something had shifted. The land wasn't alone anymore. It had a voice, and it was getting louder. The HOA meetings were typically held in the Rosewood Bluffs clubhouse, a building that tried desperately to resemble an old southern estate with faux Greek columns and a grand chandelier that was just a little too big for its vaulted ceiling. Most meetings were sparsely attended, filled with the same 6 or 7 faces, those who liked to hear themselves speak and see their names in the minutes. But this time, the room was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled the space, neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, some perched along the back wall. The air buzzed with anticipation. Some were there for gossip, others for curiosity, and a handful because they had quietly rooted for me all along and now had a reason to stand in the open. I stood near the door, folder in hand, while Ben, my attorney, sat beside me, calm and unreadable. Councilwoman Renee Hargrove was there too, in a simple gray suit, pretending to be just another concerned citizen, though her presence carried a quiet authority that made Karen noticeably uncomfortable. Karen entered late. She walked in with that same clipboard and the same practiced smile, but the crowd didn't part for her this time. She had to shoulder her way to the front, her heels clicking too loud on the tile floor. She took her seat at the center table, flanked by 2 board members who looked distinctly less confident than usual. The meeting was called to order. And then came agenda item number 4, motion to reclassify Parcel 4HG as HOA jurisdictional property. That was my land. They tried to dress it up in legalese, boundary ambiguity, communal visual impact, fair neighborhood access, but the truth was clear. They wanted my land, my pool, my history. Karen cleared her throat and launched into a speech, prepared and rehearsed. The HOA's mission is to protect and enhance the value of all properties within the community. When a single parcel presents a deviation from those values, we have a duty to explore reintegration for the good of all residents. Mr. Green's parcel has been a point of confusion and disruption. By bringing it under HOA governance, we can ensure uniformity, safety, and shared benefit. She went on, but something had shifted in the room. The more she spoke, the more fidgeting I saw. Crossed arms, raised eyebrows, whispers. It was as if her words, so polished and practiced, had lost their spell. When she finally finished, the floor was opened for public comment. That's when I stepped forward. I didn't shout. I didn't raise my voice. I just spoke. This land was purchased in 1953 by my grandfather, Lester Green. He was a cartographer who mapped this region before most of these roads existed. He cleared the trees himself, built the house with his hands, and marked the boundaries with iron stakes that still stand today. The pool you're so concerned about. It's not a monument to luxury. It's where I found peace after a divorce, after the death of my brother, after years of noise and loss. I paused, scanning the room. This isn't about aesthetics or communal value. This is about power, about rewriting maps that were never yours to touch. I have every legal document, deed surveys, signed affidavits from county officials, and even a journal entry from my grandfather's surveyor. This parcel is private. It always has been. The only reason this is an issue now is because someone saw something they wanted and assumed silence meant surrender. I handed copies of the documentation to the board, placing them down one by one, slow and deliberate. I won't surrender. Not to manipulation, not to misinterpretation, and not to anyone who thinks heritage is something they can vote away. A hush fell over the room. Then someone clapped. Just one person, an older woman in the second row. Then another, and soon half the room was applauding. Not loud, not raucous, just steady, grounded. Karen looked like she had swallowed a lemon. Councilwoman Hargrove stood next. "I'm not here in an official capacity," she began, "but I can't sit quietly when I see a neighbor bullied under the guise of policy. Mr. Green's documentation is clear. Any attempt to reclassify his land will be met with significant legal and political resistance. I strongly advise the board to reconsider this motion." One of the board members, a thin man with nervous hands, leaned into the microphone. I moved to table the vote indefinitely. Another member quickly seconded. And just like that, it was over. Motion withdrawn. My land remained untouched. After the meeting, neighbors who'd never said a word to me before came up to shake my hand. Some apologized. Some offered their support. A few just said thank you and walked away. Ben patted my shoulder. "That was better than a verdict," he said. Councilwoman Hargrove pulled me aside. "They won't try again," she said. "But if they do, you call me." Karen didn't speak to me. She packed up her clipboard, her composure cracking at the edges, and left without a word. I stayed behind and stood by the window of the clubhouse, looking out across the neighborhood I had never really felt part of until now. It was strange. Victory didn't feel like shouting. It felt like breathing. That night I swam in the pool under the stars. No music, no floodlights. Just moonlight reflecting off the water and the distant hoot of an owl somewhere deep in the trees. I floated on my back, staring up at the sky, and whispered 2 words to the stillness around me: thank you. Not just to the land, but to my grandfather, to my younger self, to the past that had finally stood up for itself, and to the peace that no one, not even Karen Delaney, could take from me again. The next morning, a large white envelope arrived at my doorstep via certified courier. It was thicker than the usual HOA noise and bore the official seal of the Buncombe County Clerk's office. I signed for it, took it inside, and placed it gently on the kitchen table beside a cup of coffee that was already going cold. Inside was a final certified copy of the county's findings in response to the petition Karen had filed weeks ago to challenge my land's classification. A formality, really. My legal team and Councilwoman Hargrove had already confirmed the outcome, but something about seeing the county's seal in blue ink made it feel more real than ever. R.E. Parcel 4HG Hillcrest Glen Way. Based on the documentation submitted original survey records from 1953 and signed affidavits from living witnesses. It is the determination of this office that Parcel 4HG exists as a legally recognized privately held estate, exempt from HOA jurisdiction under all current zoning and community overlay statutes. Any attempt to impose architectural, jurisdictional, or regulatory authority over said parcel by the Rosewood Bluffs Homeowners Association shall be considered unlawful. Respectfully, Dennis Tolman, Senior Deputy County Clerk. I stared at it for a long while, letting the words sink in. It was done. Not just a temporary injunction, not a delay or a hearing pushed back to a later date. This was final. No more notices. No more motions, no more bulldozers waiting like vultures on the edge of my property. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. And for the first time in months, my chest didn't feel tight. Later that week, I took a walk not around my land, but around the neighborhood. It felt strange at first. I'd spent so long keeping to myself, letting the pines and hedgerows be my buffer from the HOA's reach. But now I was curious to see how things looked from the other side. What surprised me wasn't the sudden friendliness, it was the quiet respect. People waved. Some even came out of their garages to shake my hand. One woman brought out a peach pie and said her late husband used to admire my grandfather's stonework. I nodded, took the pie, and thanked her with more sincerity than I expected. But the most surprising interaction came when I passed Karen's house. It sat on the corner lot, immaculate as always, manicured lawn ceramic pots with cascading ivy on the porch, a flag fluttering neatly from the awning. But something was different. The HOA sign in the front yard, proudly managed by Rosewood Bluffs. HOA was gone. Karen herself stood at the mailbox sorting envelopes. She glanced up when she saw me, paused, then took a breath and stepped forward. "Mr. Green," she said. I stopped, keeping a polite distance. "Karen." There was a long silence. "I read the county's findings," she said finally. "Looks like you were right all along." "I always was," I said, not unkindly. She nodded, her eyes flickering toward the ground. "I resigned from the board." I didn't say anything. "I let it get personal," she added. "That's not what leadership is supposed to be." I suppose. I didn't like the idea of someone having something I couldn't control. That at least was honest. For a moment we stood there, two people who had waged a quiet war that no one else really understood. Then she reached into her mail stack and handed me a thin, cream-colored envelope. "I had these printed before everything shifted," she said. "You don't have to accept, but I'd feel better if I offered." I opened the envelope when I got home. It was an invitation to a community storytelling night. Nothing fancy, just neighbors gathering at the clubhouse to share histories of the land, photos, memories. There was a line at the bottom in Karen's handwriting. "You helped remind us that stories matter more than structures." I didn't reply, but I did show up. The clubhouse looked different that night. Less formal. Lights dimmed chairs in a circle instead of neat rows, a table of coffee and cookies in the back. People took turns telling short stories about the early days of the neighborhood, about the wild turkeys that used to roam the hilltops, about Mr. Portman's famously ugly Christmas displays. When it was my turn, I stood and told the story of a mapmaker named Lester Green who walked this land before anyone knew what an HOA was. I told them how he built a home without internet, without blueprints, just using the stars and his hands. I told them about a boy who learned to swim in a stone-edged pool, and a man who came home after losing too much and found that the land hadn't forgotten him. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then someone whispered, "Thank you," and it echoed softly around the circle. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. The HOA changed, not in structure perhaps, but in tone. The new board seemed gentler. Notices became suggestions. Fines turned into conversations. Someone even planted a community herb garden on the edge of the cul-de-sac, and no one tried to regulate it. I stayed out of most of it. I didn't want a seat on the board or a title next to my name, but I did accept when the high school asked me to speak at their local history project. And when the community bulletin started a Voices from Rosewood column, I submitted a story about the old bridge my grandfather once helped repair, with nothing but rope and steel bolts and stubbornness, because now the land had found its voice, and so had I. That summer I invited the neighborhood kids to the pool. Just once. We grilled hot dogs, played old country records, let the kids splash in the shallow end, while I sat beneath the maple tree with a glass of iced tea and watched generations that hadn't fought a single battle over boundary lines just enjoy. No contracts, no votes, just laughter echoing across water. And I realized then I hadn't just kept the land. I'd restored something more valuable, a sense of belonging, but on my terms, and without losing a single square inch of who I was. The cracks in Karen's legacy didn't take long to spread. It began with whispers. A neighbor saw Karen using HOA funds for landscaping work at her homework she'd insisted was community beautification. Another noticed that her cousin had landed the exclusive maintenance contract for Rosewood's common areas, despite submitting the highest bid. At first it was just gossip. But gossip has a way of becoming fire when kindling has been quietly piling up for years. I stayed out of it at first. I'd had my battle. I'd won. My land was secure, my story told. But when neighbors started coming to me, not just for advice, but with evidence, I realized this wasn't over. Not really. Karen hadn't just tried to take my pool. She'd built an entire system designed to benefit herself at the community's expense. So I started keeping a file. Emails, photos, HOA budget statements from the past 5 years, all available under public record laws. I didn't leak anything, didn't stoke any flames. I just gathered. It was Bethany Ward, the former secretary of the HOA board, who finally snapped. She showed up at my door one Saturday afternoon, tight-lipped and trembling, holding a flash drive. "I can't keep quiet anymore," she said. She forged a vote last year to raise fines, used it to justify towing 6 cars off residents' driveways. I let her inside, listened, took notes, and added the flash drive to my growing collection. By now, the new board president, Thomas Wexler, a quiet man with a background in accounting, was already growing uneasy. He and I had spoken once briefly after the parcel reclassification vote was withdrawn. He seemed reasonable, even kind, so I asked him to coffee. I brought a binder. He brought a legal pad. 2 hours later, we had a plan. The next HOA meeting wasn't packed like the last one, but it didn't need to be. The people who mattered were there, residents with questions, former board members with regrets, and Karen sitting 2 rows from the front, her mouth drawn into a taut, impatient line. Thomas stood at the podium. "There have been concerns raised about procedural irregularities over the past few years," he began. "Tonight we'll be reviewing several contracts votes and budget items for transparency purposes." Karen stood up immediately. "This is a witch hunt. I serve this board with integrity. If people have issues, they should bring them to me privately, not ambush me in public." Thomas nodded. "Which is exactly what we're doing, bringing them forward. Publicly. Because the community deserves to know." The binder was passed around. Page by page, the allegations were laid bare. Inflated vendor contracts, unapproved expenditures, manipulated votes, personal reimbursements without receipts. A pattern emerged, not one giant scandal, but a tapestry of small, self-serving acts that painted a clear picture. Karen's face lost its color. Then the most damning blow landed. Bethany stood and read aloud the minutes of a special session vote, one that never happened. "I was the board secretary," she said. "I never recorded this, and these signatures were copied and pasted from previous meetings." Gasps, murmurs. Karen tried to speak, but Thomas raised a hand. "In light of this, the board will be voting on a motion to permanently ban Ms. Delaney from holding any HOA position in the future, pending further investigation." The vote passed, unanimously. Karen gathered her things and left the room without a word. Just like that, the Queen had fallen. In the days that followed, it felt like the entire neighborhood exhaled. The fear was gone, the pretense. Residents began stepping into their yards with smiles again, hosting block parties, without worrying about mailbox flag colors or flowerbed heights. A new sense of ownership spread not from the HOA, but from the people themselves. Thomas approached me one morning as I was checking the mailbox. "You ever consider joining the board?" he asked with a half-smile. I laughed. "I'm not a board guy." "Fair," he said. "But you're a truth guy. We could use more of that." I didn't answer, just nodded and thanked him. Because the truth is, I didn't want power. I'd seen what it did. I just wanted to protect peace. And now with Karen gone and the board-humbled peace felt like something possible again. A week later, I received a letter. Not from the HOA, from Karen. It was handwritten, short, no return address. "Sam, I lost. Not just the position, but the perspective. I thought control meant safety. I thought rules meant order. But you reminded me that history is not something to edit. It's something to learn from. I'm sorry. Karen." I sat on the porch for a long time after reading it. The apology didn't undo what happened. But it mattered. Because in the end, this hadn't just been about boundaries on a map, it had been about human boundaries. About power, fear, ego, and the slow rediscovery of respect. Karen's house of cards had fallen, but what rose in its place was something far sturdier. Something built on transparency, on stories, on neighbors. That evening, I walked the perimeter of my land again. No tension in my shoulders. No fear of bulldozers or fines or false notices. Just the chirp of crickets, the smell of grass, and the rustle of wind through the trees. I passed the iron stakes again, the ones my grandfather had driven into the soil decades ago, and I touched each one as I always did. Only this time they didn't feel like defenses. They felt like anchors, because the house of cards had fallen. But mine stood strong. By the time the final audit report came back from the county's compliance committee, it read less like a summary and more like a formal indictment. Although not criminal in nature, the implications were severe enough to shatter what little remained of Karen Delaney's reputation. 16 procedural violations, 5 improper financial disbursements, 3 conflicts of interest in vendor selection, and a signature forgery accusation that was under active review. The county stopped short of recommending charges, likely because Karen resigned before a full investigation could be completed, but the consequences were swift nonetheless. The board moved to freeze her HOA privileges, vendors severed ties, and the real estate agency she worked with quietly removed her name from their agent listings. Her carefully curated life unraveled in slow public silence. And yet I didn't feel triumphant, only tired. Tired of the politics, the paperwork, the meetings, the slow-moving gears of small-town justice. I hadn't set out to destroy anyone, I just wanted to swim in my pool without fear of a bulldozer idling down the street. Still, there was unfinished business. The day the audit went public, I received a call from Councilwoman Renee Hargrove. "There's going to be a public hearing," she said. The city council's voting on new HOA oversight measures. Your story's part of the reason it's happening. I sat at the kitchen table, hand resting on the county report, and let that sink in. HOA oversight. It had never existed in our town. Each association had functioned as its own mini-government, autonomous, self-funded, with minimal legal accountability beyond civil courts. Now that was changing, and I had helped tip the scales. Renee continued, "Would you be willing to speak at the hearing?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was afraid of becoming the very thing I fought against, someone trying to control others. But this wasn't about control. It was about prevention. "Yes," I said. "I'll speak." The chamber was packed. Not with HOA board members or angry residents this time, but with lawmakers, journalists, clerks, retirees, veterans, single parents, all of them bearing some scar from an HOA gone too far. When they called my name, I walked slowly to the podium and spoke not as a lawyer or politician, but as a man who'd almost lost his home without ever being robbed. "Good evening. My name is Samuel Green. I'm a retired structural engineer, a lifelong North Carolina resident, and a man who just wanted to be left alone. 2 months ago, my community's HOA attempted to claim control over a piece of land my grandfather purchased in 1953. They issued notices, attempted inspections, threatened demolition, all without legal jurisdiction. They tried to rewrite history with forms and fines. What saved me wasn't just paperwork. It was patience. It was memory. It was the fact that I never threw away my grandfather's maps. But not everyone has that. Not everyone has a locked cabinet full of deeds and letters and county records. Some people, good people, lose their land not because they're wrong, but because they're overwhelmed. HOAs have their place. They can protect communities, but unchecked power never protects, it consumes. So I'm here to ask for change, not punishment. Just balance. Silence followed. Then applause, not explosive but steady, a recognition of truth. The measure passed unanimously. 2 weeks later, increased transparency requirements for HOAs, mandatory third-party audits every 5 years, and a new oversight committee appointed by the city council. It wasn't a revolution, but it was enough. Back home, I began receiving letters, some from strangers, some from neighbors. One from a woman named April in another part of the state caught my eye. "Dear Mr. Green, I watched your interview and read the article. I cried. I'm a single mother. I lost my backyard garden because the HOA said it wasn't uniform. They tore it out while I was at work. I had no time to fight back. No money for a lawyer. But your story gave me something I didn't expect. Hope. Thank you." I pinned that letter to my wall, because it reminded me what this had all meant. I held a gathering that fall. Not a party, not an HOA event, just an open gate. I called it the Land and Water Day. Neighbors came, some with lawn chairs, some with memories. We grilled. We told stories. Kids swam. One woman brought a banjo. At one point, I stood near the stone path my grandfather built and watched a boy skip across the flagstones barefoot, laughing like they were stepping stones to a magical world. Thomas Wexler, the new HOA president, approached me with a paper plate in one hand. "We've been thinking about starting a community archive," he said. "Photos, letters, stories about how the neighborhood started." I smiled. "I've got a few things you might want." I figured he chuckled. "And one condition," I added. "Shoot. No rewriting history. Not even to make it prettier." He nodded solemnly. "Deal." Weeks later, Karen left town, quietly. I heard from Bethany that she sold her house and moved to the coast. No forwarding address. No goodbye. I can't say I missed her, but I did think about her often. Not out of spite, but as a reminder of how even the best intentions can twist when shaped by fear. She tried to create unity through control. I found it through boundaries, the right ones, respected and remembered. On the 1-year anniversary of the first letter I received from the HOA, the one that started it all, I walked to the edge of my pool at dawn. The mist rolled gently across the water, just like it always had. I sat down on the stone ledge and let my fingers trail through the surface. Then I looked up. The maple tree stood strong above me, and beyond it the sky. Limitless. Free. Like the land below, mine. Still. And always. Autumn rolled in quietly that year. The leaves turned in layers amber rust gold like the land was exhaling after a long-held breath. For the first time in months, I woke up without tension pressing against my ribs. The HOA notices had stopped. The gate hadn't rattled with unwanted visitors. And the pool, my pool, shimmered in the morning light, without the shadow of bulldozers or legal threats looming overhead. It was mine again. Not just by law, but in spirit. I'd protected it not by raising my voice, but by standing my ground. Not with aggression, but with clarity. And now, as I stood beside that still water coffee warming my hand, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry anymore. I was grateful. Grateful for the storm because it revealed who I was beneath the quiet, and who my neighbors were too. I spent the next few weeks returning to the things I'd let slip. I refinished the deck beside the pool, repaired the stone coping with a mason's precision I hadn't used in years. I planted new grass where tire ruts had scarred the edge of the property, left behind by Karen's premature enforcement team. Each shovel of dirt felt like reclaiming a piece of my dignity. The nights were cooler now, crisp enough that I had to warm the pool before my morning laps. I didn't mind. The contrast between the heated water and cold air was strangely invigorating, like waking into the world freshly forged. Ben Callahan stopped by one Saturday. He brought pie. Pecan. "Thought you'd want to celebrate a clean year," he said, with a grin settling into the porch chair, like he belonged there. "I think I'm finally done celebrating," I said. "Just want peace." He nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "That's what you've built here. Not just stone and water, but peace. And peace, Sam, is the rarest kind of victory." We sat in silence for a while, watching the breeze rustle the last of the maple leaves. Then he said, "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd just let them take it?" I didn't answer right away. Because I had. I'd imagined it more times than I cared to admit, Karen's crew tearing up the pool neighbors, wading in like it was theirs, my memories paved over for the sake of cohesion. I shuddered. "I'd still be here," I finally said. "But it wouldn't feel like home." Ben nodded. "That's the cost," he said. "When we give up what we know is right just to avoid a fight, we stay, but we disappear." Around Thanksgiving, a boy from up the hill knocked on my door. He looked about 10, holding a piece of paper folded twice and colored at the edges with crayon. "My mom said you were the reason the pool didn't go away," he said, eyes wide. "So I made you this." I unfolded the paper. It was a drawing of my house, the pool, and stick figure kids swimming. Above it were the words, "Thank you for letting us keep the water safe." I blinked once hard. "Your mom said that I asked voice rougher than I intended." He nodded. "She said you kept a promise someone else made a long time ago." I put the picture on the fridge right beside the faded photo of my grandfather in his war uniform, and the old topo map with pencil marks I'd traced as a child. December brought snow, thin light, the kind that dusted rooftops and made everything quiet in the best way. I walked the perimeter once more, not to check for violations or encroachment, but just to feel the land. I knew every dip in the soil, every stone in the path. Every tree that had stood longer than most people here had been alive. This land wasn't just mine. It was part of me. In the new year, I was asked to contribute to a community time capsule. I wrote a letter. To whoever opens this, you may not know my name. That's fine. But maybe you've seen the pool behind the old house on the edge of Hillcrest Glen. Maybe you've heard the stories. Maybe you haven't. But here's what matters. Once a group of people tried to claim something that didn't belong to them, not out of evil, but out of misunderstanding, pride, and fear. And once a man stood quietly and said no, not to fight, not to conquer, but to preserve. Because the past matters, because peace is worth defending, because some promises echo longer than we think. Samuel Green. I sealed it in an envelope, dated it, and watched as they buried the capsule beneath the community garden that had replaced the old clubhouse tennis court. A fitting place for it, I thought, where something old had been taken and something better had grown. One evening in spring, I swam under a sky full of stars. No voices, no lawn disputes, no letters stuck in my gate, just water, light, and breath. And as I floated there alone and utterly at home, I thought of everyone who'd come before me. My grandfather mapping lines with compass and ink. My father building a life without needing attention or approval. Myself swimming in the quiet, knowing I had finally become the keeper of not just a piece of land, but of something deeper. Legacy. Boundaries that were never meant to keep people out, but to hold memory in. This was my final stand and my lasting peace.